Bien, bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Je voudrais d'abord vous souhaiter la bienvenue dans cet auditorium du pôle des langues et civilisations de l'INALCO. Je sais qu'il y a beaucoup de personnes qui ne sont pas de l'établissement dans le public. Et puis en préambule, remercier le professeur Timothy Snyder de nous faire l'honneur de venir délivrer cette conférence à l'INALCO. Merci de votre présence. J'aimerais remercier également Irina Dmitrichine, maîtresse de conférence en histoire et responsable de la section d'études ukrainiennes à l'INALCO, et le professeur Étienne Boissery, professeur d'histoire de l'Europe centrale, co-directeur du Centre de recherche Europe-Eurasie, pour avoir organisé et assuré la discussion de cette conférence. J'aimerais remercier également l'ensemble des partenaires de ce qui promet être une très belle discussion. Le Centre de recherche Europe-Eurasie, le CREE. Vous êtes ici. D'abord dire à quel point nous sommes heureux et très honorés à l'INALCO d'accueillir Timothy Snyder pour cette conférence sur la place de l'histoire ukrainienne en
2015. Et c'est sans doute parce que ces deux ouvrages qui ont été très importants dans le débat historien ces dernières années, qui avaient d'ailleurs fait l'objet de publications, de discussions dans des revues académiques assez prestigieuses, c'est sans doute parce que ces ouvrages étaient très importants que nous avons eu la chance en français d'avoir la traduction de la reconstruction des nations, qui était un ouvrage précédent, mais qui a été traduit postérieurement, qui a été traduit simplement en 2017 en français, et dans lequel Timothy Snyder met en avant, alors les interrogations, on aura certainement l'occasion d'y revenir dans la discussion, mais met en avant l'importance du facteur polonais dans la compréhension de l'Ukraine, pas seulement de l'Ukraine bien entendu, mais aussi dans la compréhension de ce qu'est l'Ukraine aujourd'hui. Même si ça n'est pas l'objet de la conférence, je ne peux que mentionner le fait que Timothy Snyder, avec Serhii Plokhy et Jaroslav Rytzak, sont impliqués à la manœuvre dans un très grand projet d'écriture, de nouvelle écriture de l'histoire ukrainienne, un projet qui s'appelle Ukrainian History Global Initiative, qui a pour vocation de rassembler, qui travaille déjà environ 90 universitaires ou chercheurs, avec comme objectif de mettre à disposition d'un public large, mais sous une forme académique, mais accessible, un très grand travail sur l'histoire ukrainienne, mais l'histoire ukrainienne sur le temps long, sur le temps très long, et en prenant en compte de manière très significative l'importance des apports extérieurs, des circulations auxquelles l'Ukraine et le territoire ukrainien actuel, l'Ukraine ou le territoire ukrainien actuel a pu connaître. Voilà, c'est la petite présentation rapide. Je suppose que dans le débat, d'autres choses pourront être abordées. Juste une petite précision, on va dire technique. Pour des raisons pratiques, nous avons renoncé à l'idée de faire circuler un micro au moment des questions. Et donc, je sais que ça peut être un peu frustrant parce que du coup, la discussion directe avec Timothy Snyder ne pourra pas se faire, mais c'est vraiment lié à des raisons pratiques. Et donc, 3 de nos doctorants qui travaillent sur l'Ukraine et sur la Russie sont là, disponibles pour circuler, vous donner des petits papiers sur lesquels vous pouvez poser vos questions et qu'ils essaieront de synthétiser au mieux pour que le débat puisse être riche et qu'il soit répondu à vos questions de manière aussi large que possible. Voilà.
Merci beaucoup Étienne. Donc je précise que nos 3 doctorants qui ont accepté donc de se prêter à cet exercice vont passer dans les travées. Il vous suffirait de faire signe pour qu'ils vous fassent passer le papier et puis puissiez inscrire votre question qui seront ensuite lues et synthétisées. En 1995, Mark von Hagen publie dans Slavic Review un article intitulé « Does Ukraine have a history ?» Ce titre volontiers provocateur n'en était pas dans son contenu, qui était une réflexion posée sur l'histoire de l'Ukraine et son étude, son inscription dans l'histoire européenne. Presque 30 ans plus tard, à la fin de l'année 2024, voit le jour un autre projet initié par Timothy Snyder et Serhii Plokhy et Jaroslav Rytzak, comme l'a déjà évoqué Étienne Boissery. Ce projet s'intitule Ukrainian History Global Initiative, réunissant les chercheurs du monde entier. Timothy Snyder y plaide pour la création d'une bonne histoire nationale, celle qui reconnaît la complexité évite les mythes romantiques et reste ouverte à l'inattendu. Le but du projet est de résister à la simplification en favorisant l'approche pluraliste fondée sur les faits qui encourage la curiosité plutôt que la certitude. L'ENALCO, en tant que l'unique établissement d'enseignement supérieur avec un cursus ukrainien diplômant en France, est ravi et honoré de pouvoir présenter ce projet et de discuter plus globalement de l'histoire de l'Ukraine dans l'histoire mondiale avec celui qui probablement ces dernières années a le plus écrit, a le plus travaillé, a le plus contribué à la connaissance de l'histoire ukrainienne dans le contexte européen. Merci.
So, of course, it's the dream of every scholar from abroad to come to France and have the students sit on the stairway. But there really are a number of places still inside. I realize this gives the impression that I'm super popular, and I appreciate it. There you go. So thank you for the kind introductions. Thank you for the kind words. What I'm going to do is to present to you one interpretation of the history of the lands of Ukraine. So the project, which was very kindly mentioned by both colleagues, is underway and will take 3 years. And I do not speak for the 90 or so other colleagues. And I have to say that because if I don't, all 90 of them will write me afterwards to explain the various points of disagreement with what I'm about to present. What I'm about to present is a kind of synthesis, and I'm very glad to have the chance to present it. I've spent all day today talking to the French press about things that happened in the last 45 minutes. I'm very happy to have the chance to actually give a lecture about things that happened in the last 6,000 years. And I'm very happy doing so to rely on the wonderful scholarship that I've had the time and the pleasure to read from other historians, students of literature, archaeologists, and others. So what I'm going to present to you today is a kind of deep history of the lands of Ukraine, keeping in mind that the lands of Ukraine are also the peoples of Ukraine, and that the people who now live in Ukraine are a result of all of the trends that I will be talking about. My basic thesis, which will be familiar to anyone who has a Ukrainian roommate, is that Ukraine is at the center of a lot of world history, I know. But what's much more interesting is actually to take your eyes off what people are saying right now and take your eyes off the politics and actually allow yourself to be surprised by just how interesting the history is. So for example, first example, civilization in the sense of the places where there were cities. The very first cities in the world, in the sense of the very first large settlements of human beings, 5,000 people together, 10,000 people together, many hundred houses together, are in what is now south central Ukraine. So civilization, as far as we know now, in the sense of the building of large settlements, begins in Ukraine. This, of course, could change thanks to modern technology, LiDAR in particular. We're finding cities all over the world we didn't know existed. But according to the present state of knowledge, by the way, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, good. Good. Nobody laughed at the joke, so I wasn't sure. Thank you for laughing at the second joke. So the oldest big settlements we know about are places called Talianki, Majdanetske, Nebelivka, which are roughly between today's Kiev and Odessa in south central Ukraine. They existed about roughly 6,000 years ago. That they are the earliest is interesting, but there are other interesting things about these settlements which are worth noticing. One is that they are representative of an entire European way of living which existed for several thousand years. If any of you are students of or have heard of the work of Maria Gimbutas, there is an idea of cities in Southeastern Europe with extensive trade patterns and social hierarchies and matriarchal religion, which she referred to as Old Europe. Like many of her suppositions, this one has held up well. And these very large settlements in what is now Ukraine were the easternmost of these old European settlements, and also the largest, the biggest ones. The other thing which is very interesting about these cities is the form they take. And this is something that Wengrow and Graeber, in their remarkable book, The Dawn of Everything, pick up in chapter 8. When you think of an ancient city or of an old city, you probably think of Uruk in Mesopotamia. And from there we have the model of a city with stone and walls and places of sacrifice and obvious concentrations of power. Whereas interestingly, in these cities in south central Ukraine, what we have instead is a big road running through the middle, no moats, no walls, houses and slightly larger buildings arranged in semicircles around the main road, which gives an impression of sociability and neighborliness, frankly. Now, no one can say for sure exactly why these cities were built the way that they were, but it certainly gives one pause for thought that ancient humans also built cities that didn't have big stone walls, didn't have obvious concentrations of power. Because, and the reason why this is important in the sense of how we think about world history is this: the story or the overarching narrative of world history is often, back then, there was terrible oppression, stone knives, human sacrifice, big walls, but slowly things have gotten better, right? However, what if it were instead the case that alongside or even earlier than Uruk, alongside or even earlier than these other Mesopotamian cities, there were places where it seems as though people lived in a different way, which didn't involve stone knives, human sacrifices, tall walls, power concentrations, and so on. What if that's the case? If that's the case, then the people who are telling you that you're free because things are better than they used to be back in old Babylonia, that narrative doesn't make much sense. If it's true that 6,000 years ago we had different kinds of cities, that suggests more possibilities for human freedom than perhaps we're used to thinking about. So point number one. Point number two, language. Okay, so these nice semicircular cities didn't last forever. They were overcome roughly 5,000 years ago by another set of very interesting people who came to the world from what is now Ukraine as well as southwestern Russia. The languages, so this is a point about languages. The first point was civilization, the second is languages. The language that I'm speaking now, or this hodgepodge pidgin that passes for a language, American English, the language that I'm speaking now is an Indo-European language. If you speak Ukrainian or French or German or any of a number of languages, if you're working on Sanskrit or Latin, these are all Indo-European languages. Roughly half the population of the world today speaks as a first language an Indo-European language. It's the largest in terms of native speakers and in terms of general knowledge. Indo-European is the largest family of languages that we have on our earth. It appears, and the evidence is only accumulating, that the original source of Indo-European languages was the Ukrainian and Southwest Russian steppe. That a group of people known as the Yamna spread various forms of Proto-Indo-European language from that linguistic heartland southward and eastward to India, southward and westward into the Balkans and Anatolia, as well as westward and northward into Europe, beginning roughly 5,000 years ago. The evidence for this is complicated. For a long time, it was chiefly linguistic evidence, where linguists trace back the origins of cognate words. there was also pretty strong archaeological evidence, much of which had to do with the wheel and with carts and chariots, because what was special about the Yamna people, it appears, were that they were the first, or at least among the first, to domesticate the horse. And if you domesticate the horse, that has two very important implications. The first is that you can farm much more productively, and you can herd much more productively, because with a horse, you can herd X times more sheep than you can with just a dog. And with a horse and a cart, you can move from place to place and cultivate or keep your herds in different places and different times of the year. It appears that these Indo-Europeans in Ukraine and southwestern Russia were the first or among the first to do that. Another implication of domesticating the horse is, of course, military. If you have the technology of the horse and your opponent does not, you have a tremendous military advantage. So if you take those two things together and imagine the wealth and the military superiority they involve, it's not so hard to imagine people with that technology conquering and merging with other people around them. The other kind of evidence, though, which has come on in the last 10 years or so very strongly, is the ancient DNA. So we, not me personally, maybe not you personally, but we are now in the position to scrape ancient DNA from human remains that are very, very old and compare them to present-day populations or other ancient populations. And that evidence very strongly confirms the thesis that the people who came out of Ukraine and southwestern Russia from 5,000 to 3,000 years ago are the descendants of a huge percentage of the North Indian, Anatolian, Balkan, and especially European population. So the European population, it appears, was largely displaced 5,000 years ago by the spread of these people with their horses and their technology and their language, which is quite a striking finding. From Norway down to France into Eastern Europe, a strikingly large percentage of the DNA of Europeans comes from this little group. Yeah. And these people displaced the prior people, like those who built Stonehenge, for example. Soon after they built Stonehenge, they were done. So this is a second, this is a different, but it is a second very important contribution of the lands of Ukraine and peoples from Ukraine to the history of the world. If it is right that the languages spoken by roughly half the world's population come from a relatively small patch of land in what is Ukraine and southwestern Russia, that is extremely interesting all on its own. I'm going to mention another little fact, which I'll try to pick up later on, which is that it appears, interestingly enough, that although these Indo-Europeans are generally associated with patriarchy, the end of the matriarchal old Europe, and a more vertical organization of society, it appears from the archaeological evidence that roughly 20% of their warriors were biological females, which is an interesting number. We're going to come to it again. Third example. So up to now, I've been talking about things which, unless you were specialists, maybe you didn't know it all. It's okay not to nod. That's right. Like Americans, if you say you don't know something, they nod. It's actually one of our charming features, right? We don't know anything, but we know that we don't know anything, right? In France, it's a bit different, right? In France, there's the pretension of culture générale, and bien sûr, Professor Schneider, of course I knew, and so I expect less nodding. So but those first 2 points might have been new knowledge for a lot of you. Another way to make this argument, as I'm going to try to make it to my third point, is that things that seem familiar, things that seem anchored in certain basic narratives of Western civilization, actually are anchored in the wrong place. And that if you anchor them again in the lands north of the Black Sea, in what's now Ukraine, you see them more clearly, understand them better, they make more sense. So I have in mind, of course, first of all, the Greeks, the Greek civilization of the 5th and 4th centuries BC. Let me start with an example from art, which I like quite a lot. There's a painting by a Dutch painter called Otto van Veen, which is from the late 1590s, and it features some women without clothing, and it features some men, and it features some armor thrown in front of the women and men. And this scene has been very confusing for people for a very long time, because you can't tell what clothes the women are wearing. They weren't wearing the armor. Like, what were they wearing? And then, but after a while, it was figured out, and this is the correct solution, that he was portraying a scene in Herodotus, which is of a meeting between what Herodotus regarded as Amazons and Scythians. Okay. So once you know that, when you hear the word Amazon, you probably think ancient Greece and the myths of the ancient Greeks. But let's pause here for a second. So we're thinking of a painting which basically comes from the Renaissance. It's hanging, if I'm not mistaken, in the Netherlands, right? And then we relocate it in our minds to some vague thing called Greece. But the place where those Scythians and those Amazons actually lived was north of the Black Sea, in what is now Ukraine. And when I say actually lived, I mean both the Scythians and the Amazons, because the Amazons, as it turns out, almost indisputably were real. The people that the Greeks regarded as the Amazons were female-mounted Scythian warriors. Thanks to, among other people, Ukrainian archaeologists, there are quite a few digs in southern Ukraine in which, once again, we find that the warriors from the Scythian civilization, which is roughly 2,500 years ago, I'm keeping these numbers very rough so we can kind of keep track of them, but roughly 2,005 years ago and forward, roughly 20% of the warriors whose remains we find are biological females. Now, just incidentally, this is a finding that we owe to modern technology, because for roughly 150 years, when these remains were dug up, they were referred to. I really love this. They were referred to as the small women, the small warriors. So for about 150 years, when these people who were buried with their weapons and their shields, and had sort of unusual pelvic bones for males, and were smaller, these people were classified as the small warriors because it was inconceivable that there could have been biological females who were fighting. Thanks to ancient DNA, right, thanks to that technology, these remains can now be identified unambiguously as being biologically female, right? So, and this is also quite recent. And once you know that, then something starts to change in the way you think about the Greeks, because if you were a product, as many of us are, of a kind of quasi-psychoanalytical reading of Greek civilization, you probably have the idea that the Greeks invented the Amazons because they were sexually oppressed, or because their women weren't interesting enough, and therefore they had to imagine these wild women who could fire arrows and so on. That's the way we did it in the 20th century. I realize you weren't there for the 20th century, but that's the way that we did it in the 20th century, that kind of interpretation. It turns out and it's whatever. It's appealing, I suppose. But it turns out that everything is much simpler. It turns out that the reason why the Greeks had stories of Achilles and an Amazon, and Hercules and an Amazon, and Theseus and an Amazon, and the Amazons fighting in the Trojan War, the reason why they had these stories was that regularly for hundreds of years they actually encountered mounted female archers who killed them. And that's the sort of thing you remember. When people kill you, you memorialize it. And that is why if you go to, I was at the Pergamon in Berlin a few days ago, and I happened upon a vase which featured a mounted female warrior, a Scythian, an Amazon, as we would say. And this then in turn reminds us of something more fundamental about the Greek civilization of the 4th and the 5th and the 6th centuries BC, which is that it was integrally related to the Scythians. So we have a lot of writing from the Greeks, and we have no writing from the Scythians, or almost none. And what we have of the Scythians comes by way of the prism of the Greeks. And of course, this is the tyranny of history, that historians only work with written sources, but most humans, for most of the time we've been on the planet, haven't been able to write. So, but when we think of Greece, we think of this like isolated bit of Athens. But that isolated bit of Athens could only survive because it was in an organic relationship with Scythia. Athens is not, I don't know if you've been there, but if you think about the terrain there, you'll realize there's a reason why they grow olives, right? That place is not agriculturally self-sufficient, hence the Athenians colonized first neighboring islands, and then when that was not enough, colonized the coast of the Black Sea, which was an excellent place for them to colonize because at the same time the Greeks arrived in ships, the Scythians were arriving on land. And the Greek civilization that grew up from the very beginning always involved, it never did not involve contact with the Scythians from the very beginning. So all of those Greek colonies, if we're taught about them at all, that's how we're taught about them, on the north coast of the Black Sea were also Scythian and involved economic and cultural interactions with the Scythians in the hinterland, who were very significant, as Greeks at the time acknowledged. So if you read Herodotus on the Scythians, he's very impressed with the Scythians because the Scythians held back the Persians on their own, as the only people to have done so, as far as he was concerned. And when we know more about the Scythians, that's less surprising to us. For example, there is a fortress at a place called Bilsk, which, unless you are deeply Ukrainian, you have not heard of, which is the largest Iron Age fortification. I watch Ukrainians Google this as I don't do that. That's a bad habit. Just believe me. There was a big fortress called Bilsk. Okay, it wasn't called Bilsk. It's at a site which is now called Bilsk, which was the largest fortress in Iron Age Europe by far. It was more significant in military terms than all of the Greek city-states put together in terms of scale. This is a completely different kind of power, which the Greeks recognized in their own way at the time. And if you read Herodotus carefully, you can pick this up. But we have lost this because of the absence of written sources and probably for other reasons as well. And if you dig a bit deeper into the things that we think of as the Greek classics, we realize actually they orbit around the Black Sea and the lands that we now call Ukraine more than we might realize. Again, it's really important, and this is a point mostly for people who are in a Western civilization narrative. I realize not everybody is, but it's really important that when we read the Greeks, we think of them as being sort of out of space, out of time, like in their own ethereal world, or at best they're in Athens in theaters. But for the Greeks, that wasn't what the world was like at all. The Greeks were a huge seafaring people, and their sense of geography was much broader than ours of them. So if you look, for example, at Aeschylus and Prometheus Bound, he is writing about Scythia. He is writing about the terrains of Ukraine. If you read a very famous drama of Euripides, which is less famous now than it has been, but it will return, called Iphigenia in Tauris. It is precisely about Chersonesus and what we now call the Crimean Peninsula. And both of those plays were extraordinarily significant to the Greeks and also to the rest of us. They were multiply reinterpreted down through the 20th century. And interestingly, both of them have very important messages that go deep into the 20th or the 21st century. Prometheus Bound, of course, is a story about freedom, in which famously only Zeus is free because Zeus is a tyrant. And so what is the version of freedom in which others are free? It is when people learn about themselves, thanks to Prometheus, and that's why he's punished, and he's punished on the Black Sea in what's now Ukraine. Or Iphigenia in Tauris is an extraordinary Greek drama because it is the only one, I believe, I will be corrected by my classicist colleagues later, it is the only one, I believe, in which a woman plays a central role in how the plot turns out because of her own resources and intelligence. So Iphigenia in the story has survived sacrifice at the beginning of the Trojan War, has been sent off to what we would now call Crimea to be a priestess for the local Scythians, and then she meets her brother Orestes, and they get into a complicated situation which is actually the template for all modern adventure movies, especially Star Wars. So if you have ever, okay, I'm looking for people who have both read Iphigenia in Tauris and see Star Wars, and I'm seeing my Venn diagram not happen before my eyes. But I trust that within a few weeks there will be people who do that. But Iphigenia in Tauris is actually the template for a couple of bumbling guys come into an adventurous situation. They're there to rescue a woman, but it turns out that the woman is actually smarter than they are, and she engineers how they get out with some impatience with them. That's Princess Leia, in case you're not following me in the story. Anyway, Iphigenia in Tauris is the template for that. In fact, this is not something I'm just making up. It's a template for that story. But perhaps more seriously, Iphigenia in Taurus was redone by Gluck in French. It was redone by Goethe. It's been incredibly influential on Western culture, but nobody would really think to say, oh yes, it was based in Ukraine, right? This is my point. Prometheus Bound, obviously, is the inspiration for romantics and revolutionaries and notions of freedom that involve rebellion and knowledge. And again, its sighting is in Ukraine. But that's not just a cultural point I'm making. I'm making an economic point and just a very basic point about what Greece was. Ancient Greece, Attic Greece, Athenian Greece only existed because of the grain that they purchased from the Scythians on the North Black Sea coast. That's it. They don't exist without that, and their culture reflects that. It's just that we don't reflect that. We don't reflect it. Okay. After Greece, I of course have to do Rome. And the point about Rome is a very interesting one, but a bit different. So again, if you're in an Anglo-Saxon view, and also a European view maybe, when you think about Rome, the story of Rome is the rise and fall, right? Edward Gibbon made that almost irresistible in his account of Rome. But in the rise and fall of Rome, or the fall of Rome in particular, there are these mysterious people called the Goths, who kind of appear out of nowhere and are unknown, but somehow they managed to both sack Rome and rule it, and found major states in Europe, but we don't know who they are or where they came from. Okay, at this point in the lecture, you know where they came from, right? They came from Ukraine. So after the Scythians, after the fall of the Scythians, the next major group for which we have a lot of archaeological evidence and some literary evidence are the Goths, who were a Germanic people, who we think came from Scandinavia, but we're not sure. The Goths, it's interesting that the Goths turn up again in Ukraine, because you can think of this as a kind of cycle of Indo-European culture, where the Germanic peoples or the Proto-Germanic peoples left this area about 3,000 years before, and then turn up again later. I find that interesting. And they'll do it again a couple more times. So the Goths are between the Danube and the Dnipro rivers, chiefly. They are driven out by the Huns in the year 376. And that encounter between the Goths and the Huns is at the beginning of some of the basic stories of European literature, to which I'll return. So the Goths crossed the Danube in 376, initially with the agreement of the Romans, but there appear to be some misunderstandings, because the Goths do something which no one had done before, which is they kill a Roman emperor, and then they do something which no one had done for multiple centuries, which is sack Rome, and then they do something which no one had actually done ever before, which is rule the Western Roman Empire as non-Romans. And in a story of the fall of Rome, this is all kind of dust and detail, right? But if your story is of peoples from the steppe doing interesting and creative things, it all seems a bit different, right? The fact that there was someone called Theodoric, who was a Goth, who ruled Rome. The fact that there was a female Goth who also, for a while, ruled Rome before she got assassinated, right, as happens by her cousin. And then we also tend to forget the way this plays out afterwards, which is that Goths found multiple states across Europe, which last for rather a long time, especially in Spain. So I was in Madrid yesterday. I was in Madrid yesterday, and I went to the Archaeological Museum and to the Prado. And it was interesting, in the Archaeological Museum, they did have a treatment of the Goths, but the Goths, as always, appeared out of nowhere, and we don't really know who they are. I would be interested if you have no exceptions to this, but in general, like even in Wikipedia, I checked, the Goths appear out of nowhere and nobody knows where they came from. The word Ukraine just never appears. But we know where the Goths were. For multiple centuries, the Goths were north of the Black Sea. We know that from the classical sources, and from the archaeological sources. It's not controversial. But the absence of a notion of Ukraine, or a name for that part of the world, makes it seem like they came from nowhere. And you see, this is my basic theme here. If you think that Ukraine is nowhere, then the things that happen in Ukraine come from nowhere, and it's very hard to locate them. But it turns out these are some very important things, like the city, like the languages that half the world speaks, like Greek civilization, like the way that Rome was transformed in the 4th and 5th centuries, like the first Spanish kingdom. So when Spain, so the Spanish narrative of history, as I was just reminded yesterday, is that that Ferdinand and Isabella and Castile and Aragon and the Reconquista, and they drive the Arabs out and so on, and restore a Spanish kingdom. Okay, but who founded that Spanish kingdom? The Goths. The Goths. But in the Spanish textbooks, does anybody say our Ukrainian forefathers came and generously founded for us a state with a capital in Toledo? It sounds ridiculous, but that is exactly what happened. I mean, I'm not saying they were ethnic Ukrainians, of course, that's ridiculous. But what I'm saying is that people from Ukraine, a few generations after leaving Ukraine, founded the state which the Spanish regarded as their first kingdom, the one which they were supposedly restoring in the late 15th century. So many, many very significant things about European history start to make more sense if we bring people from Ukraine or people from the lands of Ukraine back into the story. And I should mention that these Goths, they brought their stories with them. Stories of, for example, of a female warrior called Herfer, a story which then survives among other Germanic peoples, the Franks and the Burgundians, and then is preserved by the Scandinavians. A story of someone called Sunilda, later called Svanhild, who was murdered by the last Gothic king as the Goths were losing to the Huns. These stories were brought by the Goths from the territories of Ukraine, where they probably happened in some version. They were preserved by other Germanic peoples, then preserved by the Scandinavians, which is why we have them today. And those stories, which ultimately come from historical events in Ukraine, nearly 2,000 years ago, those stories are the basis of some pretty fundamental things, at least in Western culture, like the Ring Cycle by Wagner, which you might have heard of, or The Lord of the Rings by Tolkien, based on stories which are geographically set in Ukraine. You're doing a good job with being a blank face with Lord of the Rings, but I know you have heard of it. Nice try. Nice try, young France. I know you have heard of Lord of the Rings. Okay. Some admission. Okay, the Ukrainians are admitting they've heard of Lord of the Rings. There's a whole story about orcs, by the way, which is really interesting, but I'm going to... Okay. So those stories, all right. So who preserves those stories? And this is my fifth and final point, which is about the Viking center of the world. So again, like the Vikings have an unjustly peripheral part in European history generally. The Vikings are much more impressive than French history, for example, would lead you to believe. Because in French history, these are annoying people who come from the north, just as we were getting our statehood figured out and causing us all kinds of troubles. Whereas in fact, what the Vikings were doing was ever so much more impressive than the state which was founded in Central Europe. The Vikings were present from Baghdad to North America. The Vikings essentially carried out a globalization on a scale which wouldn't be seen until several centuries later. The Vikings end up founding, directly or indirectly, states all across Europe, from Eastern Europe to Northern Europe, to Normandy, and indirectly the form of Great Britain that we have. What the Vikings did was extraordinarily interesting. We tend to underrate it because they didn't leave behind that many written sources themselves, although later they will, and they'll be interesting. But the point I want to make is that the city of Kiev was a center of this Viking globalization. And this has to do with the fall, I'll call it this, the fall of Rome, and the emergence of Muslim Arabs as the major center of power in the world. So when that nice Visigoth, or that nice Gothic kingdom in Spain falls, it's falling, of course, to Muslim Arabs. Muslim Arabs are the world superpower, in this part of the world at least, by the 8th century, and that is what draws the Vikings to them. So insofar as you've heard of the Vikings, I understand it's because they made terrible attacks on monasteries in France, and they're very sorry and all of that. But what I need you to know, the Scandinavians today are very sorry. I'm sure you've talked to them, right? They're nice, they're social democratic, they feel a little, ambiguous about the whole Viking thing. But what I need you to understand is that Western dimension of Viking history, the part which is more known, North America, Greenland, Iceland, France, Normandy, that's actually the minor part of Viking history. The major part is the eastern part. We have more archaeological finds in Eastern Europe. We have much more interesting and significant cultural contacts in Eastern Europe. When the Vikings made cultural contact in Western Europe, who were they in touch with? boring Christians. When the Vikings made cultural contact in Eastern Europe, they were in touch with people who, like themselves, had extraordinarily interesting non-Christian local religions. Turkic peoples, Finnish peoples, Baltic peoples, Slavic peoples, all of whom had religions which overlapped with their Scandinavian religion and which enriched it. So let me pause on that cultural point. Obviously, Norse religion or Norse mythology has been immensely significant to popular culture, all kinds of culture. Indeed, the stories which Icelandic writers preserved in the 13th century and afterwards are hugely important to how Germany presents itself with Romanticism, hugely important to a whole lot of modern national self presentations. If the Icelandic scholars don't preserve the stories, which were Germanic stories, many of which eventually go all the way back to the Goths in Ukraine. If not for that, there's no German Romanticism. There's none of the familiar things that we have in a lot of these modern cultures. But those stories, okay, one of the things we get wrong about those stories, though, is the idea that they're just Germanic. So in the study of the Viking myths, the way it usually works is we look at Tacitus and the Romans and what they say about the Germanic peoples, and then we kind of jump ahead of many, many hundreds of years to the Vikings, and we say, oh, well, there's some overlap here. And there is some overlap. But there's this mystery, which is that Odin and Thor and Freyr and all of them are far more interesting than they appear in the earlier sources. So yes, the Germans had a thunder god, sure, and they had a warrior god, yes. But these characters, Odin and Thor and Freyr, they're far more interesting than anything you actually find on the continent. And there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is that the Vikings are not preserving some old Germanic thing. They're taking Germanic beliefs and putting them into contact with Finnic beliefs, Baltic beliefs, Khazar beliefs, probably also Iranian beliefs. And they're spinning them together to create this fantastic mixture, which involves Odin having one eye, which involves Valhalla, which involves female and male, and actually often kind of ambisexual magicians and magic. All of that comes from the Viking encounter with Eastern Europe. And insofar as that is true, right? So if you're Ukrainian, like one example of this that will be familiar would be the god Perun. Who was the thunder god for the Slavs, who overlapped with the Scandinavian thunder god Thor to the point that depending on which language they were using, the Vikings were probably talking about the same person. So in cultural terms, my point is, if any of this is familiar to you, right, like I've already learned, I'm not going to get you to admit that you watch Marvel movies. You've already taught me that. You out-Frenched me. I'm not even looking for that, okay? I give up in advance. But you're aware that there are big movies in which people like Thor appear, right? You're aware of that. One person nodded, I want the record to show. One person, there's one honest person in this entire audience. And you're also aware, by the way, that there's a character called Wonder Woman in DC movies. Yes, you're aware of that. The professors are admitting it. Like, the professors are like, I don't need to be cool anymore. I have kids. But just by the way, that whole business of Wonder Woman depends upon the legend of Amazons, and the legend of Amazons depends upon the historical reality of Scythian female warriors. So they're big parts of even popular culture which go back to Ukraine, or for which Ukraine is a necessary condition. Anyway, what I was trying to say here is that the whole Viking pantheon, and whatever uses we made of it, has to do with the journey of Vikings, which eventually lands significantly in Kiev, which after they manage to take control of it from the Khazars, becomes their most important city. And it was a Viking city, and they were Vikings. The most interesting ruler of Kiev was a man called Sviatoslav. He was probably actually called Sveineld, but he's remembered as Sviatoslav. And Sviatoslav used both the Viking technology of boats and the steppe technology of cavalry in order to fight wars over an area of about 8,000 square kilometers. He was the person who probably brought the Khazar Khaganate down. He also fought wars in the Balkans. He was hugely territorially impressive, and he was a pagan, for lack of a better word, Viking warrior, probably the single most impressive of them all, but not remembered as such because Eastern Europe. Which leads me a little bit into this theme of like, who are these people who actually founded Kiev, and like, how do we think about them now? So I'll close on that, because that brings us to the theme of myths and so on, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. Sviatoslav and his son Valdemar, who some of you may have heard of as Volodymyr or Vladimir, and his son Yaroslav, who some of you may have heard of as Yaroslav, these were Scandinavians. They were Scandinavians. They had Scandinavian wives, they had Scandinavian children, they had Scandinavian names. They figure in Scandinavian sagas. The Chronicle of Bygone Years, I don't know how you call that in French, probably the Nestor Chronicle. I don't know, the Poviest Vremeneklet. That is a saga. It's just a saga. It's the basic source. So for all this stuff that Putin talks about, like this whole crazy thing about like the whole thing that he's fighting this war about, it's based on this one source, and it's a saga source. The reason why it's worse than the other sagas is that it's written by monks who don't like women. And therefore it leaves out all the women, whereas the Scandinavian, no, this is a true and interesting point, the Scandinavian sagas have the women in them, which I don't have to be a big smart historian to make the point that lends it a certain air of plausibility, right, if the women are present. So in the Russian version of the story, which is based upon one saga source, the one that happened to be written in Old Church Slavonic, you have Yaroslav the Wise. And Yaroslav is all by himself, there are no women, and he just sort of out of his own chest, he emits laws, and it's wonderful. If you read the Scandinavian sources, he's Yaroslav, he's kind of bumbling, his wife is the smart one, she's Swedish, his soldiers come from Scandinavia, which is almost certainly true. And you have, although I can't say that one is right and the other one is wrong, it's a much richer and more plausible picture. And if you look at Kiev, I mean, this is like, for all you Ukrainians out there too, if you look at Kiev, most of the interesting sources about those characters are Scandinavian sources. And the one source that everybody obsesses about, this chronicle, is basically a saga source. But as I say, it's written in Church Slavonic by monks who don't like women. But it's basically saga material. So for example, like Olga, right, whose name was actually Helga, who was one of the founders of Kiev, right? What does she do? She, after her husband is killed by Slavs, who they're trying to enslave, by the way, after her husband is killed, she invites the people who killed her husband to a feast, and then tricks them into getting into a boat, which is then dropped into a ditch, and then they buries them. Okay, that kind of thing doesn't actually happen in real life. Where it does happen is in Scandinavian sagas. Or she's invited to them, and she gets them all drunk, and then when they're all drunk, she sets the house on fire. Again, doesn't happen that much in real life, but in Scandinavian sagas, just the thing, right? Or the way that Oleg, whose name was actually Helgi, supposedly dies, is that he has a horse, and he hears that the horse is going to kill him somehow, and so he has the horse separated from him, and then he later visits the field where the horse was buried, and he kicks a horse skull, and out comes a snake and bites him on the foot, and he dies. That kind of thing doesn't happen in real life, but it happens over and over again in English stories and Danish stories and other Scandinavian stories. I'm not going to go through the whole chronicle, but it's basically saga material. And if you read that saga material together with Scandinavian saga material, you get a much more realistic picture of what this place was like. Okay, I'm going to close on this. And the point, of course, is not that none of this stuff belongs to Ukraine. The point is that all of it belongs to Ukraine. All of these people from the old Europeans I started with, through the Yamna, through the Scythians, the Greeks, the Goths, all of these people inhabited Ukraine. All of them left traces there, including human traces. And what it means to be Ukrainian has to do with all of these peoples, right? Well before we get to the last 1,000 years, which is most discussed. If we have to think about this in terms of states that arise from this, Kievan Rus is an interesting state. It's interesting also what happens to it afterwards. The Mongols, of course, pass through in 1241, and the result of that is that most of Rus, this Kiev state, ends up as the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, where its languages and its customs and its law generally survive. In terms of the people of Rus who ran it, one of their direct descendants becomes the king of Denmark, which is nobody ever mentions because the Danish are incredibly polite about all this. But if you're looking for a state where the king actually directly descends from Kiev, that would be Denmark. It would not be Russia. where a very peripheral group of people who were good at collecting taxes for the Mongols took over. And they are vaguely related. They are part of the Rus clan, but they were by no means central or had any right to rule anything. So Rus, like a lot of Viking states, has a kind of post-history, but it's not the post-history that we necessarily usually think about. So Rus becomes part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which merges with Poland, which lasts till the 18th century. But now we're past the modern period, and we're past the early modern period into the modern stuff I didn't want to talk about. So just a few very brief conclusions. The first is, I think it's just really interesting to do history in a deep way, because you then confront the big categories of like large-scale causality. And you realize that the way we do modern history with like the narratives and the discourses and so on sometimes overlooks big important things like the domestication of the horse or the spread of language, like the things which maybe actually did matter quite a lot to world history. The second point that I want to make is that it's not surprising if you think about the war today in Ukraine, which is a war over resources and a war over the shape of the world, and a war of the stories we tell about the world. The more you know about the deep past of the Ukrainian lands, the less surprising that is. So Ukraine is not a country that many people knew very much about 3 years ago, but if you realize that Ukraine is actually at the center of histories of civilization, language, Greek tradition, Roman politics, European state building, and so on, then it's a little less surprising that people care so much about it today, right? And you begin to realize, in fact, it is our own problem, at least as Western people, that we have missed the obvious centrality of this place, not just to world history, but to our own stories, and that our own stories make more sense and are more truthful if we put the geography back into them. The third thing that I want to say is that it's probably not so surprising also to note that the Ukrainian national movement, when it arises at around the same time as other national movements in the 19th century, is pretty aware of much of this history and quite syncretic about it. So if you read Hrushevsky, or if you read Lesya Ukrainka, you see that these people are actually making references to much of the history that I'm talking about, and even appropriating it, right down to some of the more, it would seem to us, obscure details. So for example, Lesya Ukrainka writes a short version. Well, she writes a version of the Trojan War, but she also writes a short version of Iphigenia in Taurus, right? So Ukrainian national activists from a century ago or more were not working with a story of there were ethnic Ukrainians 1,000 years ago, which is a ridiculous story, but they were working with the story of an accumulation of popular histories, which is a much more interesting and plausible story. And then the final point that I wanted to make about this is that in all of this, and this is what I'm going to talk about tomorrow, so I'm just going to leave it as a concluding thought today, in all of this, there's a lot you can use to think about freedom. So history isn't just about, it's not about what had to happen. History is ideally about what did happen and what could have happened. And in that difference between did happen and could have happened, there's the space for human agency and human ideas and for human freedom. And in this story, there are a lot of places where we encounter, in a pretty essential way, the question of freedom. One of them, of course, is the clash between the people with the nice semicircled cities and the people who overran them. Another is the history of slavery, which is very essential to this part of the world, and I probably should have said more about. But the reason why the Vikings were drawn to this part of the world in the first place was because of Arab silver and the ability to trade slaves. And slavery remains a major theme of Ukrainian history. Another thing which is clear about, which relates to freedom, of course, as well, is the hybridity of all of this. Like the question of who you are, whether you just have to be one thing or whether, in fact, you can be several things at the same time. And that brings me to the last point that I wanted to make, which is that it may be that rather than being an unusual nation, because Ukraine has multiple languages and confusing histories and all kinds of different ways of seeing itself, it may be that that's actually not unusual. It may be that that is the way that nations in the 21st century are and will be, and that there's 6,000 years of historical fact behind why it is that people might see themselves that way and nevertheless regard themselves not just as a nation, but perhaps all the more as a nation. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Je pense qu'on va passer du temps encore à réfléchir à tout ce regard sur la place de l'Ukraine, effectivement, dans l'histoire mondiale. Je voudrais donc ouvrir la séance des questions et des réponses. Donc, n'oubliez pas que nos doctorants sont là si vous avez donc envie de poser une question écrite, s'il vous plaît. Et je commencerai par une question qui nous ramène vers l'actualité. Sur l'instrumentalisation de l'histoire au service des projets politiques. Poutine, que l'historien français Nicolas Werth a qualifié d'historien en chef, a justifié la guerre contre l'Ukraine dans un grand récit national où l'Ukraine fait partie de la Russie, qu'elle n'est rien d'autre, mais aussi en évoquant la lutte contre le nazisme, la prétendue Ukraine nazie, qu'il fallait dénazifier. J'attire l'attention sur l'excellent discours de Timothy Snyder prononcé devant le Bundestag en 2017, intitulé « La responsabilité historique de l'Allemagne envers l'Ukraine ». Depuis 2017, ce discours n'a pas pris une ride. Et si vous êtes intéressé par cet aspect, par la Seconde Guerre mondiale et l'Ukraine, je ne saurais trop vous recommander à le retrouver sur Internet. Donc ma question est, est-ce qu'on peut empêcher l'instrumentalisation de l'histoire et comment la combattre? Comment faire?
So I'm going to start by saying that I think the idea of the instrumentalization of history misses something, because I don't really think it's history at all. I think it's something else, which is the beginning of my answer. So when we say history, we simultaneously mean the academic discipline of history. We mean many things. We mean the academic discipline of history. We mean what happened in the past. But we also mean whatever anybody says about what happened in the past. And I think that third definition I'd like to get rid of, because when Putin says things about the past, like, I don't think that's an interpretation of history or an abuse of history. I think it's just not history. Like, I don't think it makes contact with history. If I say something totally ridiculous about your life, that's not biography. It's just something totally ridiculous I said about your life. And I think, so I try to use, myth or political memory or some other term, because I feel like as soon as we even use the word history, we're giving it a kind of nobility that it doesn't have. Which leads me to my second answer, which is very predictable. I think the best way to deal with political memory is to have history taught in an interesting, transnational, plausible way. And I know this is true because it's what the dictators think, right? I mean, they draw opposite conclusions. Their conclusion is, don't teach history, or if you do teach history, always teach it in terms of how we, the one wonderful nation, were always victimized by the outsiders. And by the way, that is always what they say. They never say anything else. Whether it's in the American South or whether it's in Russia, it's always the same story. We were always here, and then we were victimized by these terrible outsiders, and that's why we have big souls. It's always the same. It's always the same story. It's incredibly boring, apart from anything else. But my point is that they know why they're suppressing history. They know that if history is taught properly, people will be better at empathizing with other people. They know that if history is taught properly, people will have more starting points for conversations with other people. And they know if history is taught properly, people will understand that it's never true that we were always innocent and the other side was always guilty. But if you're taught the past as a story of how you were always innocent and the other side was always guilty, then you're going to be prepared for a politics where you're going to be manipulated by that same story, which of course is how tyranny generally works. So my very basic heartfelt answer is that we can't do without the humanities and we can't do without history. A lot of what I was talking about was from literary scholars or from scholars of myth or from linguists or archaeologists, other people who work in other social sciences and other humanities having to do with the past. We just can't do without that. If we let all of that go, and which is a tendency across the Western world, if we let all of that go, then we don't really have any way to resist this stuff. We don't have the habits of mind, we don't have the mental agility, we don't have the facts. When it comes to Putin, I just think a whole lot has to be said before we even engage with that. But it is kind of fun to engage with it anyway, because what Putin says is that
is that Vladimir got baptized roughly 1,000 years ago, and at that moment, instantaneously jumped into existence Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian nations, which have not changed at all in the intervening 1,000 years, and have the interesting dialectical feature of being different nations, but yet somehow the same nation, and being equal, but somehow subordinate to Russia. And the thing is, like, that is not, like, it's not just that that's not history, it enforces a certain view, which is that the only the tyrant has agency. So even if you didn't know any facts about the part of the world that we're talking about, the idea that nations have existed for 1,000 years and nothing has really happened in the meantime, and that shows you the whole pattern of what's going on. That's a ridiculous story if you believe that they're human beings with agency who are able to do things, right? If the idea that one guy baptizing himself 1,000 years ago created the fate for everybody on a territory for the subsequent 1,000 years, if you believe that, you're invested in an incredibly tyrannical view of how history works. That one Vladimir 1,000 years ago did something, another Vladimir 1,000 years later says something about it, and that's it. Right? No human freedom, no choices, no accidents, nothing interesting, just like this incredible tyrannical monotone. Now, the stuff, I mean, it's like the thing which stops Putin's writing about the past from being funny is the fact that he has power, right? But I don't think it stops it completely from being funny. I still think it's a little bit funny. So he bases all of this on the Chronicle of Bygone Days, which I was talking about, which is basically saga material. So he has this funny story about Rurik, who never existed, and Rurik has two brothers, and they settle some territory, and the other two brothers fade away, but Rurik is somehow Russian, and then he has kids or something, and they're somehow Russian too, and that's why there's Russia. But Rurik, okay. The story. So here I'll do a history for just a second. In many of the Scandinavian colonial stories, there are three brothers, and their names often start with the first letter, and the three brothers show up, and they show up at the invitation of the locals, which is a very convenient way to do this, and because the locals need them. Okay, and this happens over and over and over again, and it's a justification for Scandinavian Vikings to colonize. Because in retrospect, they make up a saga and they say, oh, it's not that we came here and colonized and took the stuff we wanted and integrated the best warriors into our retinue. No, what happened was these people asked for us to come in, and conveniently, we had to hand, as we always do, three brothers whose names start with the same letter. And those three brothers came in and they did the job. And always in these stories, the two younger brothers kind of fade away. And then there's one brother who remains. And this happens over and over and over again. It's a story in Gotland as well. So what Putin is doing is he's citing Scandinavian colonial apologies, right, from roughly 1,200 years ago. And the story that he's citing in particular is about Scandinavians settling Finnish territory. It has nothing to do with Kiev or any of the rest of this. So I could go on, but the thing is that this stuff, it's funny, right? Like these stories, they're not historical, but if you know a tiny bit of the history around them, then they become sort of ludicrous as well. Oh, I mean, did you want me to talk about the Nazis? I mean, because when Putin says that he's invading Ukraine because of a Nazi threat, he's doing something which is a little bit different. He's deliberately trivializing the history of the 20th century, because of course there are Nazis in the world, right? And it's bad when they run your country. Fascism is a bad thing, and Russia, for example, is an example of how fascism is a bad thing, because Russia is a fascist regime. But if you say your opponents are the Nazis, then you're not only confusing people, but you're trivializing this fundamental reference point from the 20th century, and you're doing it on purpose. And the claim that Ukrainians are Nazis is fundamentally about saying that Ukrainians aren't real. It's like putting them into this kind of category of the surreal, where you're going to say, okay, people who had democratic elections and elected a Jewish president are Nazis. Like, it's such a big surreal claim that it goes together with the idea that Ukraine is somehow not real. Its government is not really legitimate. So that's like, I think the idea that Ukrainians are Nazis and that's why I had to invade doesn't really even have to do with the past. I think it's just entirely a kind of, knowing that you're a fascist, you call other people fascists, which is a that's one of the ways that modern fascism is different. Trump does this too, that you know you're a fascist and you call other people fascists. Whatever you say about the fascists in the 1930s, like, they didn't do that. That's one thing that they didn't do.
Merci pour votre propos liminaire. J'ai bien compris que vous n'aviez pas trop l'intention de parler de la période moderne dans votre propos.
Je l'ai déjà fait et ça a suffi. Alors, qu'est-ce que vous allez faire?
Mais vous avez, ce qui était important, intéressant, c'était en fait de partir de la question du territoire, de la centralité du territoire, de l'importance d'un certain nombre de facteurs, notamment le facteur maritime. Vous avez implicitement évoqué le Dniepr finalement comme élément absolument fondamental de ce territoire. Vous avez beaucoup évoqué alors évidemment les circulations vers ce territoire et surtout vers l'extérieur. Comment est-ce que dans une période plus proche de nous, on va dire la période moderne, comment est-ce que ce territoire ukrainien a été imprégné d'autres types d'influences, ou comment est-ce qu'on peut parler par exemple d'un facteur polonais ou d'un influx polonais dans une certaine forme de culture sur ce territoire? De quelle nature? Qu'est-ce que ça implique sur le moyen et le long terme? Comment est-ce que ça permet de créer quelque chose qui peut être spécifique en termes de culture locale, culture au pluriel, culture locale, dans cette période polonaise?
Yeah, no, that's a very important question, and I'll answer it. I wanted to preface my answer, though, by saying that I'm a modern historian. I write about the modern period. And modern historians generally have the idea that nations are constructed by forces of modernity, like industrialization or literacy. And I basically share that idea, but they're not constructed from nothing. They can only be constructed from the things that are already there, so to speak, when modernization or these processes pick up. And so I think you can only talk about the emergence of modern nations if you speak simultaneously of a process which was general, happened across Europe, but you also add a kind of specificity which sometimes requires a much deeper look at history than I think I had previously recognized. So when I wrote The Reconstruction of Nations, about which you said some kind words, 20 years ago or so, or 25, I was made aware when I wrote that book that modern conflicts between Poland and Ukraine, or Poland and Lithuania, had something to do with not just the period of national revivals, but in fact with early modern history. So I pushed myself back to the 16th century, the 15th century. At this stage in my career, I'm trying to be aware of the fact that some of the things which make different parts of the world different have much older origins than that it's not just the modern nation builders working from early modern materials, but that the early modern materials, in fact, can arise from much earlier periods. And I say that without, the point is not that things that happened 1,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago are preserved in some kind of pristine state. It's rather that there are these layers and layers and layers, and modernity doesn't make all the layers disappear. I think modern historians have a certain tendency to think everything kind of started fresh with us. I started the French Revolution, therefore history started with the French Revolution, or I start with the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution created a clean slate. I think I'm exaggerating, but I think we have that kind of tendency, and I'm trying, in what I'm doing now, to be aware of the earlier periods, and that's why I didn't talk about the things where I've actually done some work, which is an example of what you mentioned. So the question would be then, why is Ukraine Ukraine? Why is it not some other thing? And so why there are modern states and nation-building movements might be a general question, but why is Ukraine Ukraine and not some other thing is a specific question. And it has to do with, I think, the older history, but of course it has to do with Poland, very profoundly has to do with Poland. So where I left the story off, most of the territory of this Kievan state, this medieval Kievan state, which was called Rus. Rus was the band, by the way, of slave trading Scandinavians, and eventually that word Rus was transferred to the political entity that they founded. There's not much sign that it referred to a people, by the way, until much, much later. The territory of Rus was mostly absorbed by the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and then the Grand Duchy, the rulers of Lithuania were also the rulers of Poland until until the 18th century. But there's a moment in the middle of that where the status of Ukraine changes, and it shifts from being subject to Lithuanian laws to being subject to Polish laws, which in my view is part of the larger history of the age of exploration that begins at that time in the world, because Polish or Polonizing landholders are able to exploit the agricultural productivity of the Ukrainian lands and become very wealthy, but also integrate with larger patterns of world trade that are emerging because of the discovery, quote unquote, and conquest of Latin America and later North America. So as I see it, my big framework, which I didn't get into, is that when Polish culture comes into Ukraine in a big way in the 16th century and 17th century, it's as part of a worldwide age of discovery, which is why I think it's appropriate, and many colleagues don't agree with me, to talk about a process of Polish colonization of Ukraine at that point. And that is why I also tend to think that the Ukrainian nation-building project is quite precocious or early rather than late, because the Khmelnytsky uprising, although there's a lot of other things to say about it, does have a highly self-aware, I think, national component. Like if it had happened in 1848 instead of 1648, we would say, oh yes, that's a national movement. It happened in 1648, but I think it still has many of the markers of an early kind of national movement. But it's a national movement which is directed against a Polish way of doing things, Polish plantations or latifundia, magnates, big landowners, most of whom are native Ukrainians, but who have taken on Roman Catholic religion and Baroque culture and the Polish language. So it has the character of a kind of Ukrainian on Ukrainian civil war, the Khmelnytsky uprising, but with Polish culture very much in the mix. So Khmelnytsky himself, as they may not teach you in Ukrainian schools, was a student of Polish Jesuits, and his best written language was Polish. He spoke Ukrainian, of course, didn't speak Russian, didn't understand Russian, but Latin, he did know Latin, though, because he was a product of all of this. And the story of Khmelnytsky rebelling against Poland is a story of someone who is not quite integrated. He has a legal claim, and he's not recognized as a nobleman, so he can't press the legal claim. He's an example of someone who's in this liminal position between Polish culture and Cossack culture, and he flips from one to the other at the decisive moment, which is 1648. But it is Poland in the 16th, it's that Polish-Lithuanian state which brings the Ukrainian lands into contact with a lot of the things that are familiar from West European history, like the Latin language, like the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation. All of those things happen in Ukraine in association with Poland, and so Ukrainian history is connected with Polish history. And what in Polish history is the most powerful and most interesting moment, the 16th century, the 17th century. But that's also a time when, insofar as Ukraine is defined against something, it's defined against something for the first time, which is Poland. Russia comes considerably later, right? The period of Russian-Ukrainian contact is actually very short. We remember it because it's quite recent. But compared to the period of Ukrainian-Polish contact, it's actually quite short.
Merci. Vous avez dit dans une de vos interventions que l'Ukraine donne de nouveaux sens à l'histoire, que l'histoire ukrainienne remodèle notre compréhension des sujets tels que la colonisation, la migration et même l'identité moderne. J'aimerais bien vous entendre parler un peu de ça et évoquer à ce sujet votre dernier livre, puisque vous avez dit que l'idée de ce livre vous a été donnée par l'Ukraine et par ce qui se passe en Ukraine. Et donc, je voudrais vous entendre dire quelques mots sur votre dernier livre. Et au passage, donc, je précise que une libraire est présente dans l'entrée, et que si vous souhaitez lire, signer ou acheter le dernier livre de Timothy Snyder, vous êtes bien évidemment invité à le faire. Merci beaucoup.
So the Ukraine helps us to make sense of history. I'm strongly convinced of that. The books which you kindly cited in your introduction, Bloodlands, for example, show how the things we think we understand actually don't make sense without Ukraine. The history. So Bloodlands is a history of mass killing in the 20th century. But the history of mass killing in the 20th century was not geographically specified. Like, in fact, the place where it was most dangerous in the world between 1933 and 1945, the time when Hitler and Stalin were both in power, is the territory of Ukraine. And that's just a fact. Like, we can disagree about the interpretations of it, but that's just a fact. But once you know that, then you can approach the history of mass killing in different ways, and you can ask, well, what was it about Ukraine? And one of the things which was special about Ukraine is something that will have emerged from my lecture, which is the astonishing productivity, the astonishing fertility of the Black Earth of Ukraine. This has been a factor literally from the beginning of history. It is what enabled ancient Greece. The fertility of the Ukrainian lands is what enabled ancient Greece. And the fertility of the Ukrainian lands was probably in part a result of the way that the nice old Europeans who built those semicircular cities, the way they cultivated the land. It seems that the fertility of the Ukrainian soil, the pasture, the steppe, was in part a human creation, interestingly enough. So the fertility of the Ukrainian lands is his deep historical factor, and we see the significance of it in the 20th century when, for Stalin, Ukraine is the critical territory he has to control, and that is a major cause of what we now call Holodomor. Hitler fights the Second World War largely to control the territory of Ukraine for the same reason, because he believes he can take over Stalin's collective farms and use them to direct agricultural production towards Central and Western Europe. So that's just one reason, but it's an example of how if you put the focus on Ukraine and you realize there was a famine in 1932-33 and connect that to the history of the way Hitler saw the region, then suddenly the history of mass killing makes more sense. Even the history of things that seem unrelated, like the Holocaust. The Holocaust has many causes, but one cause was that Hitler thought he had to control Ukraine, and that is what brought German armed forces across the territory where Jews lived. It's not the only cause of the Holocaust, but it is a necessary condition of the Holocaust. If Hitler isn't fighting a war in Eastern Europe to control those territories, then there couldn't have been a Holocaust, because that's the territory where the huge majority of the victims actually lived. So that's an example from the 20th century of how Ukraine helps us to make sense of things. This whole lecture was about examples of earlier periods where I think Ukraine really does help us make sense of things, like things that we didn't think of as being connected, or civilizational or national narratives which are incomplete or rooted in the wrong territories. Ukraine really helps with all of that. It helped me with freedom. So to answer your second question, I had been trying for about 7 years to write this philosophical book about freedom. And part of the problem with writing about freedom is that you really can't do it alone. Like, that's one of my theses about freedom, is that it seems like it's an individual kind of thing, but you can't really produce individuals except by a lot of collective work. And I was trying to be true to that thinking, because like books about freedom, at least in English, it's usually somebody presenting himself as like the lone individual who is very wise, and I'm now going to tell you what freedom is. And I think that has to be wrong, because freedom involves the things we think are good in the world. And almost all the things that we think are good in the world can only be realized in the world with other people in some form. And freedom means you have to know yourself. but you can't know yourself without other people. It's literally impossible. And this is a long subject, which I've talked about all day today, but where we've gotten to in the United States right now has a lot to do with thinking that freedom is just about the lone hero who has no connection with other people. That theory of freedom, that freedom is about being against things all the time, is, I think, a big part of how we've gotten to where we are today. But anyway, when I was trying to finish this book, I took it to various places to listen to other people. One of them was an American maximum security prison where I taught the book for a semester, and another was Ukraine, because for different reasons, these were people who were talking about freedom from a perspective that was different than mine. And so I took the book with me, literally took the draft with me to Ukraine, and I talked to Ukrainians and listened, and they helped me make these arguments. They helped me make the arguments about positive freedom, because not only do they use the word, which Americans do, but Ukrainians tend to use it with a purpose. They tend to, I think, rightly say that that freedom can't be about just an us and them in the present. It has to be about some vision of the future, or that freedom has to be positive in the sense of not just driving the Russians out of a village, which is just deoccupation, but making the buses run again. Like that would be something closer to freedom or liberation. Just the Ukrainian word, deokupatsiya, which doesn't exist in English, although I'm trying to make it exist in English, that word deokupatsiya, the gap between deoccupation and liberation, is a very important gap. Like it's something that gets you to think about what, besides the absence of evil, do you need to actually be free? And it's rather a lot. So in settings like that, like in deoccupied territories, talking to Ukrainians, I was able to put some flesh on some of the arguments which I wanted to make. There are a lot of examples of how Ukrainians helped me with this book, but I'm just going to pause on that.
There are a few questions that, the first one actually are based on the battle of narratives. Actually, you perfectly demonstrate the fact that since the beginning of history, Ukraine has a central role in Europe, or even in Europenness, but there are still this idea that is promoted by Russian propaganda since the beginning about the fact that Ukraine is not a country at all, Ukraine hasn't exist, it's not a real country. So we would like to know why these facts that you explained during your speech were hidden, why, how, and also is it because of the name of Ukraine itself, which means, of course, border, because why this? Because they decided we can't refer to Ruthenia, which is dated back to the history of Rus. And also there is this idea that Russia branded itself as a country without colony. Why do people believe this statement?
Okay. The first thing I want to say, just to make this clear, is that you don't have to have an interesting history to be a nation. You don't. You don't have to have an interesting long history to be a nation. If you did, then people would, be telling other people that they're not nations because they don't have a long and interesting history. And a nation exists because people believe it exists and are willing to do things for it, like take risks or build institutions. You can't prove a nation exists or doesn't exist by way of historical argument. What you can do is you can say the way the nation is or comports itself might have something to do with the more or less modern history of the place. Or you can say the history of this nation or this place helps the history of other places to make more sense. You can say things like that. But I just want to be clear that it's not like an obstacle course where you have to prove that you are 100 years old, 1,000 years old, 10,000 years old to be a nation. That whole premise is wrong. So if it were true that you had to have a really old history to be a nation, then obviously Russia wouldn't be a nation. And Russia is a nation. It is. I'm not getting a lot of nodding, but there is such a thing as Russia, but Russia's not old. It's just not. The idea of a Russian nation is decades, not centuries old. The Russian Federation, founded in 1991, is the first state which was in some way maybe for Russian people. right? The Soviet Union and the Russian Empire were not states for a people. The idea that the polity belonged to the people is very new in Russia, and this is something which gets turned around. Like everyone thinks the Russian national movement was old, and then there were these like upstart Baltic or Caucasian, but it's the other way around. I mean, the Russian nation in terms of national movements comes much later, because the Russian idea was an imperial idea and not an ethnic one. The people who ran the Russian Empire were not ethnic Russians, nor were the rulers, right? So Russia's quite new, but that doesn't mean that it's not a nation. And the landmarks of Russia, like where Moscow is, Moscow's a relatively new city compared to other cities of Rus. The first cities around Moscow were founded by Swedes or other Scandinavians. That's what the archaeological record unambiguously shows. The people who lived there until quite recently were not Slavs, but Finnic speakers, right? So Russia's not that old, but it's still a nation. I'm just saying this because we can talk about how more or less interested we are in the history of a people, but we don't want to deny existence to nations on the basis of our own historical arguments. And that's what, even if Putin were right about everything he says, and of course he's ludicrously wrong, but even if he were right, it doesn't follow that a nation's not real. Like every American who exists could be entirely wrong about everything about America's past, and America could be very new, but we're still a nation. We're still a nation regardless. So like this modern Ukraine is actually Hazaria, and the reason why it's not legitimate is because its elites are Jews, and therefore it doesn't really exist. So the Russian propagandists don't say that stuff out in the open to the West, but there is a whole Hazaria thing which goes into the attack on the legitimacy of and if any of you who follow the Russian far right will have seen this stuff, because it's thanks to Gumilov, it's a pretty major theme in the attack on the legitimacy of Ukraine. But in historical terms, it's kind of interesting, because if that was true, and it seems to have been true, like in part of the chronicle that I think probably did happen, where Valdemar, aka Vladimir, aka Volodymyr, is disputing which religion to convert to, I think that probably did happen in some form. But the Jews who would have been talking to him about Judaism would have been Khazars in Kiev, most likely. It wouldn't have been people who made some kind of long trip. It probably would have been Khazars in Kiev, where they probably did have temples. So and if that's true, then where did those Jews go? And this is hot politically now, because of course, if there is a view among some Israeli Jews that, oh no, like all the Jews they must have originally come from Palestine, they couldn't have come from anywhere else, and that's hot politically because people who try to doubt the legitimacy of Israel say, if you're not from here, they don't have a right to it, which is of course ridiculous, because nobody's actually from anywhere, especially if you go back thousands of years. But so it turns out whether the Khazars are Jewish or not has implications for both Russia's attacks on Ukraine and for attacks on the legitimacy of the Israeli state, which makes it a sensitive topic. But nevertheless, there's a historical truth, which seems to me to be that the Khazars probably, at least the elites, probably were Jewish. So that's another very early Jewish theme in Ukrainian history. But the main influx of Ashkenazic Jews has to do with the Polish period and the 16th century, when Jews were brought in, sometimes with Poles, in order to help found towns and help found plantations. It's from that point forward that you have the phenomenon of the Shtetl, which just means, Shtetl is just like Stadt in German. Shtetl just means little town, right, in Yiddish. So it's from that point forward that you have the establishment of the main line of Jewish civilization in Europe, which is the Ashkenazic, Yiddish-speaking Jewish civilization in Ukraine, which then survives all the way into the 20th century and into the Holocaust. And so it's thanks to that Polish-Lithuanian experiment, and in particular, the Polish move into Ukraine in the 16th and 17th century, that Jews become a large-scale feature of the Ukrainian population. And then, as the question suggests, Ukraine, along with Belarus and Poland, is the center of Jewish creativity for several centuries, because it's the center of Jewish life.
Do you think that's possible to connect the modern Ukrainian nation to every people living in Ukraine during the last 6,000 years? And given how much your idea of freedom is based on the future, how can we feel free when the future feels near impossible?
I'm gonna I get bonus points if I can connect those questions, right? If I can answer them in one question. So the answer to the first question is yes. Like I am convinced that, you know, I mean, I don't mean this mystically. I just think that there's an accumulation of things which we don't always see, but which nevertheless matter to us. And we're born into a world which has been influenced by all kinds of things which we don't necessarily understand, but which are real. I have no doubt that growing up in Ohio in the United States, my experience of childhood and therefore my whole life had to do with peoples who had been there for thousands of years before me. I can't necessarily define how, but I have no doubt that this is true, that they left some kinds of traces, a few of which we can see. So yes, I don't doubt that the previous 6,000 years has something to do with how Ukrainians live now. I have no doubt about that at all. It's as true of Ukrainians as it would be for Egyptians or for the Chinese or for the Iranians or anyone else. It may be that one way to explore Ukrainian history is to think, though, about the sheer diversity of incredibly important developments on the territory, which I think is unusual. I think it's unusual to have so many crucial turning points of history happen on territory, and that may have something to, like, not away from thinking about what a better America would be, just in this example, right? So the future would be, just in this example, right? So the future, like, the people who are oppressing us are either taking the past away or they're taking the future away by forcing us to talk about a stupid past, or they have like an incredibly implausible view of the future, like we're going to go to Mars, for example, right? Which, like, you don't have to be a historian of the last 6,000 years to know that that isn't going to happen, or that we're going to live forever. Like, they're colonizing the future with their dumb ideas. And so either the future is being colonized, you know, by the dumb ideas of billionaires, or we're being forced to, like, think about how great we were in the past, or both things at the same time, right? Or both things at the same time. Like, Putin's idea that there's no Ukraine is both an idea about a past that never happened and an idea of the future, right? That's the armory of the authoritarians, and we have to have a different armory, and our armory has to, or, like, I'm not calling you all to action, this is the history talk, but if we're thinking about a better future, we have to have ideas which allow us to generate that better future and not just engage with their bad ideas. And for me, positive freedom is that idea, because positive freedom is the condition in which we're able to think about all the good things which we might be able to commit to and realize. And once you start thinking that way, you are then working the muscles that think about the future.
Do you think that freedom as a value is the imperative only for modern Western civilization, or was it the imperative since the beginning of human history? And a second question, what do you think about Trump's colonial claims regarding Canada, Greenland, or even Eastern Ukraine minerals, and how it can or cannot be connected to Putin's colonial claims?
Sorry, what was the first one again?
Do you think that freedom has a value?
Yeah. I'll do the second one, then the first one, because the first one's a good note to land on. Okay, so with Trump, I mean, so I started my talk by saying, like, I'm so happy that I can talk about 6,000 years of history, because I spent all day talking to the French press about Trump and Musk. But some of you didn't take the hint, apparently. All right. I'm just starting to see who looks guilty out there, but nobody looks guilty. You all just look happy. So with Trump, first premise, Trump is less important than Musk. And whatever Trump is doing, probably the first way to handle it is to think of it as like, okay, so I once watched a pickpocket at work on the Paris Metro. And this is how they did it. There were 3 guys, and 2 of them, you may have seen this yourselves, 2 of them pretended to be in a fight. Like, suddenly there was like some kind of fracas, and they were grabbing each other, and they were yelling at each other, and drawing all kinds of attention to themselves. And meanwhile, the 3rd guy, while everybody was watching that fight over there, the 3rd guy was picking pockets. and then the doors, and they timed their fight like between the two stations, so the doors were going to open. And so and then when the doors opened, you could see who it was because all three guys ran out the door. The two guys who were pretending to be in a fight suddenly stopped their fight and ran out the door together. And the guy who had picked some pockets, and like after he ran out, I literally saw people go like this and right. So Trump is those two guys who are pretending to be in a fight. And Musk is the one who's going around picking pockets. Like if you apply that as your heuristic for what's going on, I think that's the best way to think about Panama and Greenland and Gaza and all this other terrible stuff. Like it is terrible, but the main thing that's going on right now in the U.S. is that Musk is trying to carry out a digital coup, which ends with him and his people controlling the computer systems of our treasury. And other important governmental departments. I think that's the main story. And it's a hard one to report, or it's harder than, Greenland, right? Like, or Gaza, right? Like I don't mean to betray any secrets, but we're not actually, no matter how terrible we are, and we can be pretty terrible, we are not, in fact, about to ethnically cleanse Gaza. That's not about to happen, nor are we about to invade Canada. I see some skeptical looks from those of you who read like Le Monde Diplomatique, but we are in fact not about to invade Canada, nor are we about to ethnically cleanse Gaza. We do terrible things, and we have done terrible things, and I'm not trying to trivialize that or deny it or any of that. What I'm trying to say is that I think at this stage of the game, Trump is mainly the court jester. And you have to take your eyes off the court jester and put your eyes on the king. And the king is Musk. And if you do that, I think you'll get better results than trying to figure out what's actually going on with Greenland and Canada, So the second part of the question is, what does that have to do with Putin? It makes Putin's life a lot easier, obviously, because whether or not we do anything about, in our coming multidimensional war against Denmark, Panama, Canada, who am I forgetting? Mexico, right. All this from a country which couldn't beat Afghanistan, like, let's be realistic. But whatever happens in our coming multi-front ethnic cleansing war against everybody, the real truth is just by talking about it, Trump is doing something meaningful, which is he's undermining the very norms that we've been trying to hold up as the reason why what Russia has done is wrong. And he's undermining the norms that we're trying to hold up vis-a-vis Taiwan, right? So this is what, for better or for worse, this is what the Europeans and the Biden administration have been talking about, that there is an international legal order, you shouldn't invade other countries, and we're going to defend that order. But when Trump says, oh, maybe I'm going to invade Greenland or Canada, or I'm not going to rule it out, he's making Putin's life easy. And for me, it's kind of the worst of both worlds, because I don't think, later this is probably being recorded and I'll look stupid, but I don't think that Trump is actually capable of making America a great power in the style of China or Russia. I don't think he has the attention span. I don't think he knows enough about the world to do it. What he is capable of doing, though, is getting rid of the kind of power we do have as a power that sets the rules and then sort of plays by them or gets other people to play by them. So I think what Trump is going to do is he's going to push us off like one pedestal of power, right? He's going to push us off that, but he's not going to get us on to another one, which would be bad if he did, but I don't think he's capable of it, is my point. I think we just kind of go like this. Our friends don't trust us. No, we can't ever talk about the rules. If you're talking, like if every day you're talking about invading a different country, you can't then go back to, oh yes, and we are the guardian of the international order, You can't do it, right? So I think he's making things easier for Russia and China without actually building up America as that kind of great power. So I think the result is entirely negative. Negative in the sense of I think we're much less powerful under Trump than we were under Biden, which is something that like Trump's followers cannot possibly even process. But I think objectively it's true. On Western civilization, no. I don't think freedom has to do with modern Western civilization. My book is a philosophical argument, and if it's and I'm going to say something super conservative now. If it's true, it's true, and if it's not true, it's not true. So I'm trying to make the correct argument about freedom based upon what I take to be correct arguments about values. And if it's true, it's true. And if it's true, then somebody should be able to read it in a completely different civilization and a completely different time, for that matter, and debate it with me or talk about it. My book is not about how modern Western civilization has it right about freedom. It's not even refereeing what people think about freedom. I don't honestly care that much. What I care about, okay, I do care as a person. But in the book, what I'm trying to do is make an argument about what freedom really is, given what kinds of creatures we are, that we're born, we die, we can get sick, we need empathy, that sort of thing. And of course, I am located in a certain biographical and historical space, and I can't get too far beyond it. I mean, I'm trying to use thinkers from other cultures and so on. I can't get beyond my own place, and I'm not going to pretend that I can get to everyone else's starting place. But the argument is not a defense of modern Western civilization's ideas of freedom. The argument is what I think freedom in fact might be. And I'm pretty confident already from experience that I can have the discussion about what freedom really is with people who are from different cultural traditions than my own, because I've done it and it's happened. And if you read the book, which I hope some of you will do, you'll see that it's really not about, it's actually not a super Western argument. It's not about it's about how alienation is bad. It's about how isolation is bad. It's about how the individual can only be cultivated in a conversation with the other. It's not about, I'm trying to say that our negative idea of freedom has led us to some of our gravest problems. And I'm not saying throw out freedom. I'm saying we have to do freedom in rather a different way. So I guess the short answer would have been no, but I gave you the long answer. Il semble que ça suffit comme ça. Encore merci à tous. Дуже вам щиро дякую. An American says 10 words in foreign languages and gets applauded.
Merci, thank you. Дякую за